For people who were previously religious, what broke your faith? My papa was building a dam in Pakistan in the 1950s, hired by the Canadian government. My nanny, 18-19 at the time, came out to stay with him but didn't know she was pregnant and didn't know it was triplets. They lived on a base type place and I believe it was the Canadian Red Cross who provided the medical care. She gave birth, one was stillborn, the other lived a few days and the last a few months. The priest didn't make it in time to bless the stillborn, so he told my grieving nanny that all her babies would unfortunately burn in heck. My papa never went to church again. So he told my grieving nanny that all her babies would unfortunately burn in heck. What the frick? When I was high school age, my congregation found out our pastor was HIV positive. He said it was from blood exposure at a car accident. The entire church turned against him because he had a gay disease, so I watched a couple thousand people turn against their leader. Quite the opposite of what good Christians should do. Watching the hypocrites made me turn and never look back. I can be a good person without going to church with people like that every week. I remember reading years ago about a man whose wife got AIDS from a transfusion. They were Southern Baptists and the entire church turned against them for the same reason. He described how he felt more true compassion and love from the gay men at the AIDS clinic than he ever did at church. This was a few months after my father passed away. I was 13 at the time. At first, everyone at my church was awesome. Groceries and cooked meals were delivered every day up until the funeral. Just a little background. My dad was the breadwinner. I'm not entirely sure what his life insurance policy was, being 13 and all, but within 4 months my mom and I did not have running water at our house, so new clothes were definitely out of the question. I showed up to church one Sunday in black dress pants with a small bleach stain near the hem and a pair of flip-flops. I was scolded by 7 different women between Sunday school and worship service. When my mom picked me up, I told her, and she cried all the way home. I never went back. And I thought a big part of religion was about helping people less fortunate than you, not making fun of scolding them. It sort of cracked over time. There was no single event, but I started piecing things together and finding holes in the stories as I entered adolescence. I started wondering if anyone thought this was actually for real. To me it had always just been a really nice fairy tale, and seeing adults who genuinely believed it freaked me out a little. And then one day at school I asked my friend why he was an atheist, and he said he thought of brains like batteries in flashlights. Once it runs out of juice, it's lights out. It doesn't go anywhere after that. It's just gone. That really clicked for me. And then my parents' church collapsed due to money and corruption. So there's the final nail in the coffin. Former LDS, Mormon, checking in, learning the actual history of the church, rather than the whitewashed version that is presented by the organization, coupled with learning actual historical context around the events in the Bible did it for me. The way the church handles money and all the businesses it owns didn't help either. It didn't break. I was just honest with myself. I just didn't believe it. It was tough to do because it felt like I was abandoning something that I should believe in. Now that I'm a non-believer, religion seems so absolutely ridiculous to me. I feel the same way about modern religions as I do the old Norse gods or even Santa Claus for that matter. Fun fact, early Icelandic Christians were never dedicated to Jesus. They'd often worship whoever occupied the territory. It was Jesus at home, Thor at sea, because Thor was better at making boats survive trips. So many innocent people around me dying years ago. Little sister and Nana hit the hardest. My Catholic family assured me it was God's plan and it would make me a better person. Frick that. My little sister didn't deserve the hand she was dealt. Eventually science picked up the pieces for me. Trauma. Repeated trauma caused by someone in the church. The church decided to subsequently cover it up. He got to move on and I feel trapped in a nightmare. You're not alone. Also, expose him. Teacher in religion class, for which I always got an A in, mentioned extra credit for a trip to Washington DC. Got up at 3 AM, got on the bus with all the other nerds who cared about extra credit, rode hours into DC during snowfall, then we stopped at a church. Now being a young high schooler, the only thought in my mind was holy crap, I'm in DC, and we get free donuts while inside the warm church before we walk into the National Mall. My excitement was through the roof. However, I failed to notice the hundreds of people packed into the church, prepping signs and handing them to each other, including us. So, my class and I walked into the National Mall, again during snowfall, and I immediately noticed something was off. There were thousands, and I mean thousands of people marching down the path and streets in the mall, along with thousands more on the sides, both chanting and yelling. It was a freaking pro-life rally, with a smack dab in the center of the pro-lifers, encouraged to chant "God is great, He knows best." Now I am completely pro-choice. Never had any doubt about it. Like, come on, let people make their own decisions. So once I realized what was going on in the march, I broke the sign I was given earlier in two, dropped it before anyone noticed, put my headphones on and ignored everyone for the rest of the day. I also ate as much of the church's donuts and drank my fill of apple cider as I could once we returned from the march. That stuff was good. TLDR. Poe's school tricked us to attend a pro-life march with the promise of extra credit and a trip to DC in the middle of the winter snow. Alcoholics Anonymous. First 3 steps. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood Him. There was a day where I thought, frick that, if I'm not going to drink, it's going to be my own dang willpower. I don't need to relinquish responsibility of my life to some higher power to be successful. Soon realized religion and faith in general is used a lot as a way to shrug responsibility for an individual's life. Oh, you sinned, well you couldn't help it, you're descendant of Cain. Ask for forgiveness and try not to do it again. Plus you always feel a looming presence watching over everything you do, and you let this presence take over a lot of your thinking. TLDR. Started thinking for myself and accepted responsibility for my life. We admitted we were powerless over alcohol. Sort of ironic they have you first admit alcohol has power over your life, then tell you to essentially give something else power over your life. No, you should have power in your life. Your decisions, whether good or bad, are your own. Adolescence. That's when you begin to think about things instead of just accepting them. The question I asked was a simple one. If you didn't have this religious tradition, if it hadn't been handed down, could you create it from scratch just based on what you see in the world today? The answer was no. None of it was self-evident. I grew up loving the people in my ultra-conservative evangelical church. Then I asked my pastor for help because I was struggling with lust for another woman. He implied that people like me burn in heck. Frick that. He is no longer a pastor and his son, my former friend, is currently in jail. I am gonna marry that woman next year after spending the best 6 years of my life with her. When I held my 2-year-old baby sister as she died in my arms, the pain and terror in her eyes was unfathomable, and although she was too young to talk, her look said everything. I'll never forget that look. What God allows such a thing? If there is a God out there, He won't get any respect from me. I went from kindergarten through 12th grade in Catholic school where I went to mass at least once a week in school, then I would go to mass again on Sundays. At 13, I was definitely very religious. However, by the time I was 18, I was agnostic at best. Basically, the more I read and compared different parts of Catholic dogma and the Bible, I realized that they contradicted each other and most rules were arbitrary at best. From that point on, it became difficult to take any religion seriously. I grew up in a Methodist church, but religion was never really the focus in my opinion. My parents weren't that religious, it was more about socializing. Naturally I questioned things about religion and was never 100% on it. When I was old enough, about 15, I went on a mission trip to Belize to help build a new preschool. We stopped at a roadside fruit stand to buy some fresh fruit for later. We bought 2 papayas the size of watermelons, and we made it through one before I never wanted to see papaya again. I took the rest of the papaya to little old lady next to the school. She was thrilled to have it. Later that night we did our first "Where did you see God today?" reflection. My youth pastor recognized my generosity giving away the papaya. I thought that was nice of him but also freaking ridiculous. What were you thinking of doing with that? Throwing it away? Allowing it to rot? Of course I gave it to a local. That's the whole point, is for us to help them. I didn't think that was very godlike, just basic human kindness. Then I thought about how there was only 15 or so people in my group, but thousands in my congregation. And I thought about how much money it cost for us to get down and help them. And I thought about how many people chose to spend their time and money in other ways. I'm older now and realize some of the complications that go into navigating life, but I lost a lot of faith in humanity too. In general, there's way too many fricked up things happening for me to justify it as God's plan. Then I went to college and took a philosophy course. That killed any doubts I had really. I was raised Jewish, so I already knew that Santa Claus was a lie that every other parent told to their kids. I remember classmates in the second grade legitimately believing that he was real, and I found that very strange. Years later, I discovered that the tooth fairy was really my mom, so it didn't take too terribly long to put 2 and 2 together and realize that God is just the next level up for stuff like this. P.S. Legitimately believing that a talking snake, no, not Satan, a talking freaking serpent, which lost its legs as a result of its sin. So it's basically a Rudyard Kipling story called How the Snake Lost Its Legs, Caused the Fall of Humanity from Eden, which is apparently a place that people can't physically get to or observe in any way, and men and women actually have the same number of ribs, and the Bible would involve endless incest to get to where we are today, and Noah would never have been able to find 2 of every animal on Earth, which would, incidentally, involve gathering 12 million insects, minimum, as there are about 6 million species, and you are simply not keeping track of all of that. Santa Claus was a lie. Shut up. I read a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. There's a part where the author, a slave, is describing a sermon during a service. This is in the 1800s, so slavery is big in southern US. These white slave owners were using religion to say that it's a sin for slaves to rebel against their masters. That's when I realized that really, throughout history, people use it to gain and increase power. Whites using it to keep slaves in check. Or maybe using it to basically collect money to forgive people of their sins in the 1400-ish. We as humans don't have to believe in it, other than to keep us sane before we understood the world. But now as a non-believer I just don't get how people continue to follow their faiths. Taking a philosophy of religions course and anthropology of religions course in college, learning critical thinking skills, seeing all the hate strongly religious people spread. Just thinking is sufficient to lose faith. Religion teaches you not to think about it. For all of my middle school and high school years, I thought I could make up for the sin of being gay by being the best Christian kid ever. All I'd heard was love the sinner, hate the sin, and crap like that. So I thought I might be accepted if I was celibate and avoided the lifestyle. Then I saw how gay people were actually treated by my church, and every other church in my town. And I realized that there was nothing I could do. Their homophobia is so strong and unfounded. I couldn't be in the church without hating myself. When I decided to leave, I felt amazing. I haven't looked back. The problem with love the sinner, hate the sin in context of gays is that it implies that being gay can be fixed. It can't and doesn't need to be fixed. Being gay is part of someone's identity. If you hate their sin, you hate them. Being exposed to people that claim to be loving Christians but contradict everything they supposedly believe in with their everyday actions. Thought it was supposed to be a religion of love when it turned out most good Christians I knew were the most hateful, morally unsound individuals. I read both Bibles back to back when I was about 16. Afterwards I realized all the stories felt like fables and legends I had read growing up. On top of that, realizing that there were multiple translations of the Bible throughout history, so the idea that anybody has the correct version is ridiculous. Also, discovering the actions of the church throughout history, from the Crusades to Mother Teresa. A combination of church people, ridiculous rules within religion, educating myself, and learning critical thinking skills. My father is an ordained minister. There was an elderly guy at my church who stopped attending for a while when I was younger. The dude was suffering from major depression. Everyone there, including his own family, pretty much ignored him. So, my family and I took him in, inviting him over for meals, social gatherings, even taking him back to church when he felt ready. He was really cool, and with both my grandfathers having just died, he took over that role for me. He committed suicide after a year with us. His last words to me were, "I think of you as a grandson, and sometimes my only grandson." Crap hit the fan. The religion treats suicide as a sin, and everyone, my family included, is talking about how much of a coward he was and how he's not going to paradise. I kept my mouth shut, but that did it for me. If there was a God, I couldn't imagine him in such a place. You know, suicide equates going to heck is fricked up when Dante from Inferno even says that those who took their own lives don't deserve heck. My sister died when she was 2 months old. She was born with Edwards syndrome, and everyone knew that there wasn't an expectation of her living past her first year. I was 7 when she died, and my parents told me that she died because God wanted her to be with him in heaven. At first it made sense to me and I was at peace with it, but as I grew older I realized that my sister had been in pain the few months she was alive. My parents turned to their faith and that helped them, but I couldn't believe in a God that made a 2-month-old baby suffer just so she could go to heaven. When the pastor I'd known for my entire life refused to answer certain questions or told me I wasn't old enough, I was in high school, to know some things. I quit going to church a few years later and really stopped believing in God about 3 years ago when I had a miscarriage. My mother said, when we told her I was pregnant, that it was God's blessing. And when we told her about the miscarriage, "God's just testing you, WTF. Mom, I broke so hard. I seriously almost ended up in a hospital psych ward on a 72-hour hold. Except they didn't really think I was that much of a danger to myself, because clearly, sitting on the kitchen floor, sobbing hysterically, with a knife to my wrist isn't dangerous to anybody, and they didn't have a bed. So they sent me home with a dose of Ativan in my system, a sample pack of antidepressant, and the suggestion to call a therapist. Which I did, and I saw her exactly twice just so I could get a prescription for antidepressants. I struggled, for months, to pick myself up off the ground, and not once, not even for a moment, did I feel any sort of divine presence in my life. I figured God, if he ever existed at all, had said screw you, you're not worth it, and I was going to give him the mental finger. I didn't need that kind of crap in my life. I am so sorry you went through that with no support. I hope things are better now. Both of my parents are PKs. I spent my entire life devoted to my church. I played on the basketball team, started singing in the choir in preschool. I was on the board, spent my summers up at camp as a camper or staff, never missed a Sunday morning or a Sunday night, or a Wednesday or a Tuesday for that matter. From preschool until I was 21 years old, I showed up multiple times a week. When I was 21 and moved to another state for med school, I found a church there, and I showed up. Then, I had a child. At 11 weeks old, she died. I showed up my entire freaking life for something that couldn't show up for me the one freaking time I needed it. I carried my daughter, birthed her, held her in my arms every day, all the while praising a God that took her from me. Frick that. Being bullied as a small child while adults stood by and said they didn't want to step in and defend the family in case they stopped attending church. I didn't remember any of this until I was in my 20s, but I'd already started distancing myself from the church before then. It was never one thing, it was a lot of little things. I still find the idea of God comforting. It's humans that are messed up. Messed up humans seems to be the majority of why people leave religion. In this thread at least. I'm so sorry you were bullied. You didn't deserve to be treated that way. I realized everything was just a front. My grandmother was the most religious person I knew. Went to church at 7 AM every single day, as was one of the rudest people I had ever known. Grew up in a small, rural, God-fearing town, and I had only encountered one gay person in high school, and I hated the guy. He was a shat, not because he was gay, but he was a shat. Moved to a big city for college, moved in with my grandma, and suddenly so many gay people, and they were the nicest people I had ever met. Had a gay man as a coach for my speech and debate team, and the guy walked 4 miles in downtown Portland to make me a visual aid for a speech I had been selected to a state competition for to give me a leg up. I did up act such an act of kindness. I didn't hate gay people, just didn't understand it since I had zero exposure and the only exposure I had was negative. If anyone could hate these people for who they are, I wanted no part of that. Flat out refused church from then on. Broke some family ties due to it, but I didn't need that crap anymore. Funny story to end this with. My grandmother got really sick towards the end. Stopped going to church and seeing her friends, and she became so nice and caring I was completely thrown off. In 6 months she went from hating gays and a die-hard Republican to watching MSNBC and complaining about how gays can't get married. 2005 for reference in CA. One of her lifelong neighbors I have known since my birth went to the same church every day, and I honestly don't remember life before him and his wife. Was at all my birthday etc. Ran into them at a grocery store and they were yelling at a lady buying groceries with food stamps, demanding that she thank everyone in the store for paying for her. I can't honestly say I was ever religious, but it's things like this that remind me why I'm not. Ex-Jehovah's Witness here. My brother is special needs. He was seriously ill in intensive care. Didn't know he would pull through. Our broke down and we had little money, so what money we had we spent on taxes so we could be with him. Even though that meant having little to eat. Not person visited, offered to give us a lift, or even called to ask how he was. But they all have a crap about someone's husband who was a non-believer, inundating him with visits, gifts, even cooking for him. So much so he wrote a massive thank you card for the whole congregation because he couldn't get over how nice everyone was. This so-called congregation didn't think it was right that my mum took my brother out of residential care even though he was being abused, because it meant she couldn't spend as much time at the meetings or on the ministry. So any troubles we had with him meant we were in our own. I just couldn't be in the same room as them, let alone serve their God after that. Frick you Jehovah Witnesses, you self-righteous fricks. The very modern and all-inclusive church we were attending at the time, turning on my brother when he came out was the final straw, but just coming of age made me question all of it, and I realized I just can't believe in a magical sky fairy. Started high school in a bigger town, combination of philosophy class, seeing different lives than church one. The more I thought about it the less sense it made, and if my quest is one for truth then I must willingly follow that quest. Have great respect for and still aim to live my life with a good social rules from the New Testament. I respect both new and old wisdom. It was a slow wearing away for me, to borrow Neil deGrasse Tyson's expression. I had faith in the God of the gaps, and those gaps just kept getting smaller and smaller for me. Being taught the Bible is the word of God, it made me question things after finding out the Bible had been edited by people. Or when you are told that the Eucharist is literally the body of Christ when it is clearly not flesh and blood. So God diminished somewhat for me. For a while I was content with faith in a non-literal Bible. I really loved science and was learning to think critically. I began to realize that I had more faith in science as a process. It could be tested, and it wasn't absolute. Also, the explanations for creation and life are simpler, following Occam's razor. So, maybe God did create everything, but it seemed more likely to have arisen naturally. God, for me, had diminished to maybe God made the Big Bang and everything went from there. I began learning about other world religions, and how convinced every culture is that they have the one true faith, and I ran across the philosophical argument that God cannot be both omnipotent and magnanimous, or else he would not allow the suffering we see in this world to occur. Now I consider myself agnostic atheist. There's no way to prove that there isn't a God, but I don't believe that there is one. This is the closest to my own story, right down to your philosophical examples. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.